Lessons 2-4 and 2-5, multiplying and dividing integers. Let's imagine that you are in an airplane that is descending or moving downward at a steady rate of 200 feet per minute. So here's your airplane. Right, and we said that this plane is descending at a steady rate of 200 feet per minute. Okay, because it's going in the downward direction, the rate would be negative 200 feet per minute, right? The negative sign simply implies that the plane is moving in the downward direction instead of the upward direction, okay? So after the first minute has passed, let's say that this right here is the distance the plane has traveled after the first minute. After the first minute has passed, the airplane will have traveled 200 feet in the downward direction. After the second minute has passed, the plane will have traveled another 200 feet in the downward direction. And after the third minute has passed, the plane will have traveled or descended yet another 200 feet in the downward direction. Okay. So my question to you is, how many feet has the plane descended after 3 minutes? Well, that's simply negative 200 after the first minute, plus another negative 200 after the second minute, plus negative 200 after the third minute. Okay, and since we're adding three integers that have the same sign, we're simply going to add their absolute values and keep the negative sign, right? So negative 200 plus negative 200 plus negative 200 is negative 600 feet. Okay? Now, another way you could have done this was simply to multiply negative 200 times 3, right? Because since second grade, since maybe even first grade, we've been using multiplication to represent repeated addition, right? So negative 200 plus negative 200 plus negative 200 is simply negative 200 times 3, which equals negative 600 feet. Okay? Notice that a negative integer multiplied by a positive integer, right, this 3 is actually positive, even though we don't write the plus sign. A negative integer multiplied by a positive integer resulted in a negative answer, right? Our answer was negative 600, okay? Which brings us to our first rule of multiplying integers. A negative times a positive equals a negative. So let's try a couple examples applying this rule. What would negative 7 times 5 equal? Well, since we know that a negative times a positive has to equal a negative, we know our answer is going to be negative something. Well, what's 7 times 5? 35. So negative 7 times 5 is negative 35. What about negative 12 times 8? Well, a negative times a positive gives us a negative, whatever 12 times 8 is, 96. So negative 12 times 8 is negative 96. Let's do one more. Let's see, positive 6 times negative 11. Well, positive 6 times negative 11 would equal a negative 66. Okay, so we now know that multiplying a positive times a negative results in a negative answer. What if we're multiplying two numbers that have the same sign? Well, we know that a positive times a positive equals a positive, right? Positive number times a positive number equals a positive, right? We've known that for a long time. What about a negative times a negative? What would that equal? Well, let's look at this very simple example and see if you can recognize a pattern. Okay, let's say we're multiplying negative 5 times 2, negative 5 times 1, negative 5 times 0, negative 5 times negative 1, and negative 5 times negative 2. Okay, let's work from right to left. What is negative 5 times positive 2? Well, we know a negative times a positive is a negative, so the answer would be negative 10. Negative 5 times positive 1 would be negative 5. Negative 5 times 0 is 0, right? Because anything times 0 is 0, regardless of the sign of the other number. Alright, so let's try to establish a pattern here. Going from left to right, from negative 10 to negative 5 to 0, we are actually adding 5 every time, right? We're adding 5 every time as we move from left to right. Okay, so continuing this pattern, we should add 5 again. So what would that make negative 5 times negative 1? Well, that would be positive 5. And what would negative 5 times negative 2 be? Well, we'd add 5 again, which would make this 10. So interestingly enough, it turns out that a negative times a negative number also equals a positive. Right? Negative 5 times negative 1 gave us a positive 5. Negative 5 times negative 2 gave us a positive 10. Okay? And those are really the only two rules that you have to remember when multiplying integers. Okay, so let's try a few examples. Okay. Negative 5 times negative 10. Well, we know now that a negative times a negative results in a positive answer. So negative 5 times negative 10 would be positive 50. Negative 6 times negative 3 would be positive 18. Okay, 5 times negative 7. In this case, we're multiplying a positive integer by a negative integer, and we know that a positive times a negative gives us a negative answer. So 5 times negative 7 is negative 35. Negative 13 times 12. Once again, we are multiplying a negative integer by a positive integer, so our answer has to be negative something, right? And what is 13 times 12? Well, that's 156. So our answer is negative 156. Now, the nice thing is that these same rules also apply to division. Right, so for example, when you're dividing, let's say a negative 12 times a positive 2, right, just like when you're multiplying, and we said that a negative divided by a positive gives us a negative answer, well, same holds true for division. Whenever you're dividing a negative number by a positive number, the answer will be negative. So negative 12 divided by negative 12 divided by positive 2 is negative 6. What would negative 14 divided by, let's say, negative 7 equal? Well, just like multiplication, when you're dividing two numbers that have the same sign, okay, the answer will always be positive. So a negative 14 divided by a negative 7 equals a positive 2. And then what about, let's say, negative 24 divided by negative 24? Once again, a negative number divided by a negative number gives us a positive answer. So negative 24 divided by negative 24 is positive 1. And that's all there really is to multiplying and dividing positive and negative numbers. See you next time.